All right, we're back. It's another Carolina podcast, off-season edition. And the off-season so far has been way more eventful than pretty much any week outside of maybe Georgia week for the South Carolina football season. Staff changes continue. Obviously, early signing period was huge for South Carolina. We're getting closer to the late signing period. We're going to have an update on that. But I think most interestingly has been all of the turnover, all the staff changes that South Carolina has undergone. Not unexpectedly, given how the season went, but I think as they continue to happen, after Will Muschamp keeps being asked in his press conferences, mostly by Colin Taylor, do you anticipate any more staff changes? At least twice he has been asked, at least twice he has said no, and at least twice there have been subsequent staff changes. We have 3 different staff changes to talk about, although one of them is just sort of an official introduction of South Carolina's new strength coach that we'll get to in just a second. But I want to remind you guys before we get into it to rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. We got a bunch of stuff going on the Gamecock Central Podcast Network right now. Colin Taylor and I rolling with the hard foul a couple times a week, trying to make some sense of what's been a very confusing and up and down basketball season. So be sure to check that out. And again, subscribe so you go ahead and get it in your feed. You don't have to worry about looking for it. It'll just be right there for you in the morning when you wake up. Wes, Chris, we're also going to talk about the national championship a little bit later. But first things first, I guess before we talk about the actual changes, it was last Tuesday, I believe, or I guess last Thursday, because otherwise we would have talked about it. Sometime last week, after we did this podcast, we got to hear from South Carolina's new strength and conditioning coach, Paul Jackson, and it seemed like the response on Twitter was way more exuberance and excitement than I would have expected from a fan base, given that he is a strength and conditioning coach, not a position coach, not a coordinator. But I can see why, because I was pretty excited. I liked listening to his press conference, and I am now excited for Paul Jackson to be part of South Carolina staff. What were your first impressions?
I mean, I liked him a lot. I think, well, part of this is the fan base is tired of so many injuries, and no matter what percentage you can actually put on Jeff Dillman, the strength staff, and all that, it's really kind of hard to prove. I tend to think there probably at least is something South Carolina can maybe do for some of these injuries. Obviously, some injuries are just bad luck, but point being, this fan base has watched South Carolina just get completely decimated by injuries the last 2 seasons, and it's really ruined any chance of either of the last 2 seasons being, exciting and successful. So, I think some of this is just the whole change. When things are going bad, people like change sometimes just for the sake of change. So there's some excitement for that. But then I think you hear Paul Jackson talk. He's got energy, which is something you always have to have in a strength and conditioning coach has to have that edge, sort of. He has it. A little bit different personality than Jeff Dillman, which I think, just for the sake of being different is important. And then you hear some of the more scientific answers and his approach and the working as far as very sprint focused and some of that stuff. And I think he had a lot of good stuff to say, and I can understand why the fan base is excited. And I imagine we saw our first video production from Justin King's crew come out. I guess that was maybe last night. I imagine we'll see a lot of those to get the fan base excited about that.
Yeah, and I think what we saw in that video, which I'll get to, and during the press conference, what we heard, I think fans were excited about Paul Jackson, because he sounds like a sharp guy, but also, he's a sharp guy, and he's a strength coach, so he's got energy. There's none of those guys where you walk away going, man, that guy needs a Red Bull or something. You never, ever hear that with any strength coach.
Yeah, he seemed like he had about 3 or 4 before he got on the podium.
Yeah, I mean, and so those things are natural, but also, just his background and some of the things that he said, I think fans walked away thinking, okay, these are some areas where South Carolina's maybe been deficient. And some areas that they could stand to improve in. And so, obviously, a lot of the questions, I thought he handled the injury questions quite well because it is a complex thing. I mean, you're playing football. It's a violent game. You're going to have some guys get injured. But just to hear his thoughts, his philosophy on it. Secondly, the speed background. So that's a thing where I think we're going to see some differences, and we'll see how those eventually play out. But just the way that he's going to train the players from a speed and agility standpoint, I think he's going to be able to get some guys faster and maximize some guys. Obviously, you got to have, and he talked about this with DK Metcalf, you're not going to be able to make guys look like that. Not everybody's going to be as fast as Zedrick Woods, at Ole Miss who ran a 4.29 at the combine.
But he also said Carolina players have already been inquiring if they're going to have him looking like
that would be mine.
Like DK Metcalf.
I wouldn't be as worried about looking like DK as I would be getting as fast as Zedrick Woods. I mean, running a sub 4.3, but you know, he does have those things where he has worked with these players. He's seen good, you know, in these skill position guys, and I find it interesting because that's South Carolina needs more offensive firepower, playmaking at the skill position. So obviously, the number one thing with that is recruiting. But secondly, what can you do with your players? Can you take it? Can you maximize it? And so I think people are excited about that. Another thing that I think is, from what we've heard, what we've seen, that's going to be a little bit different is just his involvement with the players. It seems like he's going to be even more hands-on, and we saw some of that in the video with him personally working with some of the players. I think we're going to see that, just the way that he structures the room, the way he splits things up, and the personal attention that he devotes. I think he wants to, you know, really make an effort to be personally coaching guys when possible. You can't do that with a team of, you know, 85 scholarship guys and walk 105 guys. You can't coach every single one of them every day, but the way they're going to structure it to where he can basically touch, you know, individual groups of players and have more of an impact there and make sure that they're coaching them correctly. I think those are some positive, you know, probably changes to the program.
I think we've talked about it on this podcast. If not, I've talked about it a lot on my local radio show on 107.5. But it's interesting and probably outdated that a lot of assistant coaches, you know, you have a certain amount of time. You can't talk to players during certain periods. And so a lot of it does fall on the strength coach. But regardless of how antiquated, how silly that rule may be, that's the reality. And I agree, like the impression that I got from Paul Jackson was that it was going to be a more hands-on approach. It's more about that relationship, and I think that's important because, I mean, that's the conduit to everything else the coaching staff wants to do. I mean, I imagine there's a degree of gamesmanship to it where it's like, okay, how much can we, the rest of the coaching staff, filter through the strength and conditioning coach in the offseason to basically, you know, maximize the offseason outside of just the strength and conditioning part of it, which is obviously the core of what he's going to do. So that's interesting if he can cultivate a relationship. And again, I think that's a time and a place where change for change's sake is very important, because if you're around the same people for too long, even if you respect them, even if you like them, love them, have a great relationship with them, whatever, there's a certain extent where you just kind of get tired of hearing the same thing from the same voice. So even if it's similar messages that Jeff Dillman was preaching, having a different guy in there, bringing a different energy, having a new relationship with those guys, I think can be very helpful. The other side of the equation that y'all have both touched on, and I think is really interesting because we don't know, I don't think they know. I don't know if anybody knows. But if you each had to estimate, just educated guess, as educated as you can. Wes, you go to the gym. Chris, you play soccer. Y'all understand sort of as much as anybody can, basically. How much do you think the strength and conditioning coach and his program has to do with injuries? What would you say the percent correlation is, with 100 obviously being all the injuries are directly related to the strength and conditioning program, and 0 being they're all just weird accidents?
Well, I think you mean at South Carolina, or you just mean in general?
Let's say in general.
Well, it's hard. I mean, I think ideally, you want for 100% of the injuries, which this is never going to happen, but you want for 95% of the injuries to be just freak accidents. Mm-hmm. A guy, or not just a guy gets rolled up, a guy steps wrong, you know, not soft tissue issues, not I pulled my hamstring, you know, I pulled a groin, just, you know, injuries like that are the ones that you can absolutely not prevent all of, but you can prevent 90% of them. I think you...
Well, theoretically, some guys are probably more just predisposed to that, and we kind of saw that with Deebo Samuel, and he had to change a lot of the way that he approached football in terms of his conditioning, in terms of his dieting, to kind of fix those things. So,
which I think that is a good example of actually using your strength and conditioning program, using a scientific approach to saying, okay, this guy is a little bit different, so we have to now sort of pivot and handle things differently with him than we do the average kid. And I think that's a big part of it. Is it's not, you know, every guy is a little bit different, and you sort of have to do a good job of sort of focusing in on what makes each individual a little bit different and tailoring your program to them. I think for one, you almost never want to have actual weight room injuries. So that's a big part of it that strength and conditioning coach plays a direct impact in. And
I think, drop dumbbells on your foot.
I think
pro tip.
I think having just using the wrong technique,
right?
Too much weight at times. There's a bunch of different ways a guy can pull something or roll something, or sort of come up gimpy in the weight room. You never want to have those.
Wes, what's your worst weight room injury?
Ankle sprain.
Really? How'd you
ankle.
do that? Were you doing like box jumps or something?
Yeah, it was like a team building type drill, and we had to jump medicine balls like laterally, and we were tagging. You had to like tag in your partner when you were done, and my partner thought that I was done, so they went to tag me while I was jumping a medicine ball, and they like touched me while I was in the air, so I came down right on top of the medicine ball and like rolled over top of it. But
man, so you would not be a good jump ball receiver.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying I got you don't have a medicine ball under you if you're jumping on a field. But
yeah, that's true. But guys are running into you. No, I'm just kidding. That's.
But I think it's very, very hard. I'm not trying to dodge the question. It's very hard to put an actual number on it. But if you start, let's just say this: if you start having a bunch of injuries that are sort of that sound like that, he's got a pulled hamstring, he's got a pulled groin, stuff like that. That's probably a bad sign. If hurting a knee, rolling an ankle on the field, stuff like that. Now there is, I believe, research that says even some of that can be prevented by proper
cleats.
Yeah, proper cleats, proper body maintenance. Stretching correctly. Eating correctly, all this stuff. But
then it seems like even within that, there's like a real gray area where it's like, yeah, hamstring injury, probably theoretically preventable. Torn ACL, nothing you can really do about that. But then there's this whole weird gray area about like, what if you sprain a knee? What if you, like you said, just kind of like roll up your ankle? Some of that's like preventable. Yeah. Or, not preventable, because you see like, it happens all the time. An offensive lineman like just gets rolled up on by one of his other offensive linemen that gets knocked over. It's like you can't really do anything about that. But like you're saying, how much of the rest of that in terms of that middle ground? Because I guess what I'm thinking about this year, I guess now to zero in a little more specifically on South Carolina, is how many of the significant injuries that they had were preventable. It's like Jake Bentley having is it a Liz Frank injury or is it Liz Frank surgery?
Liz Frank injury.
Okay, Liz Frank injury on his foot.
Fracture.
Like Liz Frank fracture, right. So there's nothing really you can do about that. Nick Muse tearing his ACL, like there's not a whole lot you can do about that. I don't remember. Did Rico, he broke his hand or something? Was that it? They kept him out for a couple.
Rico hurt his knee this year.
Yeah, he had.
Someone had a hand in
last year. Tyson Williams broke his hand.
Yeah, maybe that was it.
I think in the Ole Miss game, right? Maybe.
Didn't AJ Turner have a hand injury as well this year?
Yeah, maybe that was it.
But yeah, there's so many, and then you get to the philosophy of where, because if you roll your ankle, part of the rehab to that is trying to build up the muscle around it to where there's a less chance that you can roll it again. So there, there some guys may.
This is a pro Cankles podcast.
Yeah, like some guys may get hit in the knee a certain way, and they tear an ACL. Other guys may get
the same
hit,
way and they're fine.
Then.
But okay, Chris, do you have a number in mind?
No, I could,
because I'm thinking like 35-40%.
I mean, yeah, and I'm with Wes.
Injuries?
Yeah,
I'm not giving like the cop out answer, but
we all both are now.
You really if you gave an individual situation and said, "Here's this guy, here's how many injuries he's had in the past, here's blah blah blah," then maybe you could say it, and then what type of injury it is. If somebody tackles him and he breaks his collarbone, that doesn't have anything to do with the weight room,
right,
unless he has never drank milk in his life or whatever, But if you get a guy and you say, "Here's this guy, he's healthy," and you find out later that they're telling him to do, I don't know, power cleans, and they're overloading him, or they haven't taught him properly. Like a lot of people get on this thing. They're like, "Well, we do or we don't need to do Olympic lifts, like do something different." Well, there's nothing wrong with Olympic lifts. Are good if you're teaching them properly. Make sure you're teaching it properly. Make sure you're not overloading guys. if a guy can squat 600 pounds but he's doing it with awful technique, who cares? It doesn't matter. This isn't a weightlifting competition. You're trying to train football players. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd go that high because, like, the number one predictor for future injury is past injury.
Right. Yeah.
It was like when the doctor told me, like, I'm like, well, why did I get a hernia aside from, some of the sports I play are like high impact type of things, strains. But he said, well, it's past hernia, which I did have one when I was a baby.
Really?
And so then it's like begs the question, well, how did I get that?
You were lifting even as a baby.
I guess so. Yeah. Starting early, lifting the bottle or whatever. But, so you look at past history. You look at, and we've seen some guys at South Carolina, like, remember they had a couple of shoulder redos basically on the surgery. So that, you get a guy say, well, why is his shoulder hurt? Well, he injured it in high school, and then they messed up the surgery, and so now you're having to do it again, and he's out. So there's just so many different factors between how are you training, what's your diet, what's his past injury history. I don't know if I'd go that high. I might go
so maybe 25?
Maybe even lower than that.
Okay, so yeah, this is great. So we all agree it's less than 50%. Maybe significantly, maybe marginally, but the point is, even like even a liberal estimate would probably say it's not 50%. And I think we all agreed at the time when South Carolina let go of Jeff Dillman, ostensibly it was like, okay, well, we need to change something because we have all these injuries. But that's not really why they let Jeff Dillman go. I think it had more to do, like we're saying, for the change for change's sake, getting someone in there to have a different relationship, a different voice, a different kind of message, just to sort of re-empower that part of the team. So I don't know exactly how much of an impact Paul Jackson's hire is going to make in that department necessarily, because there's 6 guys missing spring. Mo Kaba tore his ACL in high school, so obviously had nothing to do with South Carolina strength and conditioning program. Nick Muse tore his ACL. Nothing you can do about that. Dylan Wanham, his hips were growing wrong, so like that's not Jeff Dillman's fault. The other guys, let's see, there's 3 more guys. Somebody else had some kind of chronic like genetic issue that had to get resolved this offseason.
And well, Tyreek Johnson had the sublux kneecap,
right? Sublux kneecap, like Ortre. Yeah, so I mean that's not Jeff Dillman's fault.
And then Jalen Dickerson had nerve damage. We don't really know that he's had some weird
and then there
injuries.
Was one more. Who was that? I don't remember who the other one is. Doesn't matter. Point is, a lot of these weren't Jeff Dillman's fault, and it's not necessarily going to be up to Paul Jackson to solve them. But to whatever extent those things are preventable, whether it's 25%, 35%, 15%, 5%, whatever the number is, I think what you mentioned earlier, his sprint-based approach is really compelling. As someone that knows almost nothing about strength and conditioning, especially at this level, it's weird because I've always just considered sprinting like, oh, that's just like what you do. That's just like part of working out. But that's seems to be his central philosophy. And it makes sense because football is a game of sprint and recover, 50, 60, 70 times a game. And it seems weird that anyone's approach would not be that. And that conditioning your players for that specifically could prevent some of those more preventable injuries. And I think that's really interesting. And I don't know, I have no idea. If you put a gun to my head right now and said, what was Jeff Dillman's like central philosophy of strength and conditioning? I don't know, because I never asked him, and I don't remember him talking about it in his introductory press conference. So it very well could have been the same thing, in which case, I'm excited and cautiously optimistic for no real reason. But to hear Paul Jackson talk about it, to describe sort of his process in building a program around that, I think does give you some optimism that whatever percent of these injuries for Carolina that have been preventable might be reduced in the coming years.
Well, it is interesting because you look at, like, a lot of people think about the whole philosophy of, get bigger, stronger, faster, and get conditioned better, and you just think about, okay, run, what are these crazy numbers of the gassers or whatever they would run in the 110s? Go run
9,000. Go like 30 110s.
Go run 30 110s, and it's like, wow, that sounds really hardcore, and it is. But is it?
Oh my gosh!
There is a place for that.
It's like 3 miles of sprints.
There are some days where you're probably going to have
2 miles of sprints.
Yeah, I mean, there's some days where you're probably going to have days where it's just like sort of a get tough day, and you're just sort of dropping the guys like flies,
Yeah, and that's exactly what he said. He's like, we're not trying to make them throw up every day, but some days we're going to be dropping guys.
Yeah, I mean, you want to do that some because there is from a foot. I mean, it's football, but most days you're not just going out there and say, okay, run till you're dead tired. Is that really training the player? It's the same deal with weights. Okay, if you're just loading up the bar and say, look at all this weight I'm throwing up. I mean, that's cool, but are you throwing out your back while you're doing it? Are you being productive with it? So being productive with the runs, having sort of a progression of, and he talked about that some, without remembering the numbers off the top of my head, of getting guys to run at certain capacities. And then, one thing he did say, I remember, how do you get better at sprinting? How do you get faster? Well, you sprint, and at the end of if you run 25 110s, it's only natural, unless you're a robot, that you're not going to be at the capacity you were on number 1 or number 5. You can eventually get a little bit more to where you're running at a higher percentage, but you need to have that progression of maybe running less at a bigger speed, greater velocity, and then you sort of progress from there, and then you get faster. And like you said earlier, Pearson, that's what football is. I mean, there aren't many times where you're running 100 yards, period, but a lot of it is about start, stop, oh, by the way, while somebody's trying to kill you, on the field.
Mm-hmm. How many 110s, I'll say first of all, how many 110s do you think y'all could run right now if you just, hey, stretch, go out there? I mean,
I could run all 30, but my last one would take me about a minute.
Yeah, I was going to say, how many could you actually run similarly at a speed similar to what your first one was?
Is my first one 100%, or can I run this at 80?
No, I mean, I don't think anybody can go out there and do 100. Even these guys, you're pacing yourself a bit, right? It's 110. That's...
I could probably do 15 to 18.
What do you think the average person?
Oh, like listening to this, just walking the streets, or average person on Carolina's football team?
No, the average person just
3.
That may be high.
I did a similar workout with my brother this summer because he was training for soccer. He plays at Wofford, and so
soccer people, when it comes to running, are just
it's
insane.
ridiculous, and it's a very similar kind of conditioning. Like, I was a lot better for soccer conditioning and rugby conditioning when I was doing those than just running cross country, because it is more like sprint and recover. But it was like, oh my God, we used to do these things in rugby called Henny Mullers, where you start on one corner, because rugby field's the same as a football field. You just count the back season, so it's 120, and you start by sprinting diagonally across the field, jog the short side, sprint the other diagonal, jog the short side, sprint the long side, jog, sprint, jog, just sprinting all the long sides, and that was one. And we would do 3 or 4 of those after practice.
I'm getting tired just thinking about that.
It was brutal.
We did
like a New Zealand thing.
One of the F3 workouts we did on a Wednesday, it was called Fuel or something. I went once when I was actually right after my hernia surgery. Not right after, but several weeks after, and that was my first running. That was sort of a bad idea.
Whew.
Because it was a 45-minute workout, and we did, I can't remember, it was and I think it was 100 yards, and we did 20 to 30, something like that.
Oh my gosh.
It was pretty rough.
Yeah.
But I took it pretty easy because,
you had a hernia.
I was still sort of hurting then.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was, thinking about doing that at as close to as hard as I gone, I would have passed out.
And if I'm sure,
especially in July.
And when they would do these 110s, depending on your position group, you do have to get there in a certain amount of time for it to count. Mm-hmm. There being time to keep them, to make them actually run. But it's human nature. If you have 28 of these things, you're getting there. You're pacing it to the. You know how long it takes you, or how much energy you have to exert to do it in.
Yeah, if you have 13 or 14 seconds to do it, you're going to take 13 or 14 seconds to do it.
Exactly. It's not a true sprint.
Yeah.
You're pacing it to where you get there right before the cutoff. So I think Paul Jackson's point is, let's cut the field down to an actual distance we're going to normally run, but then you're truly sprinting. It's more of an interval training type approach. Sprint, recover for a second, sprint. But when you're when you're on, you're at 95%, 99, whatever, as opposed to 75% capacity, I think.
So I'll be very curious to see if there will be a noticeable difference in this team in that respect this season. I don't know if it'll be, I don't know if it's one off season's worth of progress we'll be able to notice, or if it'll take a couple years. I don't know, but he was fun to listen to in the press conference.
And, whenever a new coach comes in and wins the press conference, everybody's like, this guy's going to be great.
Everyone's going to look like DK Metcalf. Ryan Helinski's going to look like DK Metcalf.
Yeah. But I do think he comes across as a guy that would connect with the players.
Yeah.
A little bit more, I feel like a little bit younger energy. I don't know. I like it. Positive change, I believe.
That was a really productive and informative press conference as well, because not only did we get our introduction to Paul Jackson, but I think a surprise to a lot of people, and I had seen it just a couple hours earlier. Wes, I don't know if you actually scooped this. If so, nice job. If not, you were the first person that I saw mention that we might get some other coaching news in that press conference, and we did. And it was, in fact, the hiring of Joe Cox, the wide receiver coach from Colorado State, who was there the entire time Mike Bobo was there, who followed Bobo now to Columbia to be the tight ends coach, which pushes Bobby Bentley to maybe the quarterback coach or assistant quarterback coach, some kind of offensive support. And for those of you that missed this conversation last week and are like, well, wait a second, now you have one too many assistant coaches, that is pushing Kyle Krantz off of his on-the-field role into an off-the-field analyst role. But I think the biggest part of this is bringing in Joe Cox, someone that South Carolina fans will remember. He beat South Carolina in 2009 as the quarterback for Georgia.
That was a great football game.
Yeah, that was. He was, let's see, he was like 17 of 24 for like 200 yards and 2 touchdowns and a pick. Was it 41-37, something like that? So Carolina fans probably don't have good memories of Joe Cox. But you had one more Georgia guy to the staff, because I know all Carolina fans are thinking, you know what, this staff's really missing? Another Georgia guy. But you bring in
also bonus points that he was also at Colorado State, too.
Right. Yeah, so double continuity bonus, which in all seriousness, right after the hire, I talked about it with Eric Camry on my local show, and it was like, when you have a lot of staff turnover, it's nice to have some continuity between a lot of the coaches to sort of ease that transition, and I think that's no small part of why this hire was made. The other part of it, before he started coaching in college, he was a successful high school coach for a couple of years in North Carolina, so he's familiar with some of the high school coaches, some of the high school programs, probably already has some relationships in terms of those recruiting trails, which is a big part of it, obviously, for South Carolina in that Rock Hill, Charlotte area, where I think he's going to mostly focus his attention. But overall, this seems like a pretty good hire for Carolina.
I think a big part of it was getting in a guy that has worked under Bobo, understands his system, understands terminology for it, understands exactly what he wants. Every offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator really wants to have his guys on staff, I think. Now, for South Carolina, part of the reason we talked about it, that it worked out with Bobo, is that he's already got several of his former guys, B-Mac, Thomas Brown, on staff. So
not to mention you got Colin Hill and Adam Prentice in the locker room now, helping, I guess, ease that transition with the players as well.
Yes, that made sense. Now, I think Joe Cox, being a guy that he's worked with, that he sees as an up-and-comer, that he, I imagine, wanted to continue to work with, obviously wanted to continue to help out as far as his career, and wanted him around. It just makes sense. Everybody wants somebody that understands them around, and this sort of moving Kyle Krantz off the field really was the, I guess, only way that it made a lot of sense. You could have, I guess, conceivably just brought in Joe Cox as the role that Bentley's in and left everything else the same. Would have also made sense. But as far as taking a guy off, the on-field staff, taking Krantz off is what made the most sense, I think. So, we'll see. He's a young up-and-comer. We've had people complaining about the fact that it's another Georgia guy. We've had people complaining about the fact that he came from Colorado State. Fact of the matter is, none of that matters if he can coach, and none of that matters if he can't coach. Really, what matters is if he can coach or not. Where he came from, where he went to school, the fact he was at CSU, none of that matters whatsoever. It's about, can he coach?
Sorry to interrupt you. I have a question. If South Carolina could be as good of a program as Georgia was when they were rolling with Mike Bobo and when B-Mac was an assistant there, and Thomas Brown, I think, was a grad assistant there at one point, is that a negative?
Depends on who you ask.
Well, it would be a vast improvement from where things are right now,
I'm being
right?
a little bit sarcastic, because I think people that like to complain about those things just like to complain, and we'll find
Like-
things to complain about anyway.
Like, I know Georgia didn't win like a national championship, but they played in Atlanta some, and they were generally quite good. Everybody's like, well, they only scored 7 points against the 2012 South Carolina team. It's like, yeah, that team whipped a lot of people. You know, I mean, like, that was like one of their worst games in South
That was
Carolina.
also a perfect storm
It was
for
just-
South Carolina.
Yeah,
I mean,
it
you
was
had like
just-
an interception on a tip ball, the third possession of the game. You had a punt return.
Yeah,
and that was
yeah.
I don't know,
And the
maybe
stadium,
the best South Carolina defense ever.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe the best South Carolina team, top
Yeah.
to
it
bottom.
was the best South Carolina team. I don't even know if you can argue that.
That was
But anyway.
a perfect night for South Carolina.
It was.
Game day.
So
I
yeah,
camped
like
out that night.
a lot of
on the
people go
horseshoe.
and they look,
It's sick.
well, Georgia only scored this many points in that game. Yeah, I mean, they were pretty good. I mean, like, and then everybody's like, well, why can't we have a running game like Georgia? Well, I mean, maybe this is. I'm not saying this is going to be it, right? But
you got Thomas Brown, Georgia. You got, Brian McClendon's still on staff, Georgia. You got Mike Bobo, Georgia, and you got Marshawn Lloyd, who's from he's from Delaware, isn't he?
He's from Delaware, but he's
he
like
was-
a
he
big
was a
Georgia
Georgia
target. He's the
guy.
type of back that they always.
So there you go.
forget.
You're putting together the Georgia offense and the Georgia backfield right there.
Yeah, so I mean, all I'm saying is like, and everybody's hung up on like, well, Muschamp, like, I mean, people get hung up on it really has nothing to do with whether or not it works, if Muschamp knows the people or if he doesn't. Is it a good hire? Because he's hired people he didn't know in the past and they didn't work. And he's hired people he's known in the past and it didn't work. Or sometimes he's hired people that work at other positions that he's known or vice versa. So, I mean, I think the big deal is, are you hiring a good staff? It doesn't matter. I mean, Dabo Swinney at Clemson has hired or taken commitments from a bunch of people with, he's got ties to or buddies of his, right? That's worked out pretty well. And I'm not saying that's going to be the case here. I mean,
it's complicated, and you can extend this to everything. It's not just football. It's corporations and business and just everything you do. There is a lot of value to having continuity, especially when you're changing an offensive system. You bring in Mike Bobo. That's a big change. You're changing the verbiage of your offense. You're changing the philosophy of your offense. You're changing the play call. You're doing a lot. So what can you do to smooth that transition over? Because you basically have a year to figure this out until you're back exactly in the position you were in at the end of this past season. So what do you do to smooth it out? You bring in the quarterback that ran Mike Bobo's system. You bring in the fullback that was like really an integral piece of what they did at Colorado State. You bring in their wide receivers coach. You coach your tight ends, and again, just to be another liaison to help smooth that transition. So I think there's a lot of value in having some of that continuity, but you do have to be careful, because a lot of times when you see corporations run into the ground, it's because you're hiring too much sameness. There's not enough variety. Variety, collaboration, having dissenting of opinions and dissenting voices and viewpoints in any sort of meeting room. Again, whether it's a business, whether it's, I guess football is a business, whether it's like, a suit and tie business, whether it's a, whistles and hats and tank tops business, it is valuable to have those, I guess, disparate viewpoints, because that's that's the source of like creativity and like real progress, I believe, like fundamentally. So I think some people are probably right to be concerned about South Carolina hiring all those Georgia guys, even if they're not thinking about it like that. I think some people just hear, oh, Georgia, I hate this. You can hate it, but that's probably not the right reason to hate it. But I don't know what the balance is between valuing continuity versus valuing differences. But I also think, and we talked about this when Mike Bobo got hired, the fact that he has head coaching experience maybe gives you a little more variety in your coach's meeting room to, I guess, help introduce some of that into the South Carolina staff.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Jackson hire, that's a guy that's not directly on the Muschamp
LSU
tree.
and Ole Miss, right?
Yeah,
Notably.
so I mean, you make the argument for all sides. I think with Bobo, it made, what, let's be honest, y'all, they don't have 2-3 years to install, an elaborate new system.
You have a year.
Yeah, exactly. So I imagine they're going to try to keep as much of the verbiage, as much of the conceptual aspects of this offense as they can the same. I mean, they almost have to. And I think having BMAC, I'd imagine some of what they called is called the same thing that Bobo called it, just because of BMAC's history with Bobo.
That's true.
But I think it's going to be on the staff to figure out the best way to introduce the new stuff as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And I think having these connections, and you know what, if you got what, 10 on-field coaches, you've got 85 players that are on scholarship. You've got analysts on the offensive side, analysts on the defensive side. You've got grad assistants. You've got student assistants. Having everybody on the same page, having guys you can trust when the chips are down, so to speak, when things aren't going well, it's very easy to have some dissent within the ranks when you have this many people involved in something. So there is some value in sort of going to battle with guys that you trust and that you know, and that sometimes, yes, you do need the completely new blood, completely new take. We've seen that work places, but also we've seen coaching staffs that honestly deteriorate from within.
Mm-hmm.
So having guys you trust, particularly coming off a disappointing season, it can be a big part of this as well. And I think, again, if you brought in a new offensive coordinator, to go back to that, because that's really what's made bring in Bobo, obviously being the former Georgia guy, is what made this such a Georgia-centric staff, because then in turn, that's why Joe Cox is here. That's why South Carolina brought another offensive analyst from Colorado State that has ties to Georgia as well. And that's sort of what directly led to this. But if you completely blow it up, Brian McClendon is probably not here. He's probably gone as well. Right. So having staff continuity, but also having guys in the room that like each other and respect each other is a big part of it too.
I think that's why a lot of these staff decisions have been, I think, addressed in a pretty healthy way, because, like you said, you do need to change some things. South Carolina's done a good job of changing it up, of getting some new voices in there. 3 new assistants on offense, and we're about to talk a pending new assistant on defense. But you still have enough continuity, enough familiarity between those guys, between the systems, that it shouldn't be the standard like 2 to 3 year process or 1 to 2 year process to totally overhaul it, which I think is really important. 2 more staff changes to get to. We'll stick with the on the field football roles. This was a little bit surprising. I didn't see this coming until I started to hear about it yesterday, and then it all precipitated pretty quickly. But South Carolina linebacker coach and special teams coordinator Coleman Hutzler has left for the same position at Texas. I was a little bit surprised by this. I don't know when y'all heard that this was happening, but this seems like a potentially significant loss for South Carolina, because special teams have been pretty good under Hutzler.
Well, I think the thing, when we first sort of started hearing about it, hadn't quite confirmed that it was definitely happening yet, but it looked like it was going to happen. We'd heard that it was a really good opportunity for him, and so that sort of made me think he's getting some kind of title. I don't know financially if he's getting a raise there. I would think so, but he is getting a co-defensive coordinator title. So that's obviously with a guy like Hutzler, who I think in the future wants to be a defensive coordinator and has that capability. That is something that can be helpful to your career track. And then it's just a different opportunity. He's been at some other places. Boston College was a place he was at. He's been some other places, but he was at Florida with Will Muschamp. And so sort of breaking away here to do his own thing. And you're right. I mean, special teams largely, for the most part, have been pretty good during the tenure there. And he did some good things. I know he was a valued member of the staff for Will Muschamp and a guy that they liked, and one of his first hires when he got to Columbia.
Yeah, so where does that leave South Carolina in terms of potential candidates? Who are they looking at for that next job? Is that something where you bring Kyle Krantz back into an on-the-field role? So
it is a possibility from what we're told that, Kyle Krantz, of course, recently moved off the field again after being promoted to the 10th assistant in 2018, to sort of make room. That's just how it had to work. Somebody had to either leave the staff or sort of slide off the field. And so, if the timing was different, Krantz might just still be on staff.
And I feel like that's why this is a little bit of a surprise. If they had known that this was coming even last week, again, what was that press conference, last Wednesday or last Thursday, when they introduced Joe Cox, or mentioned that they were hiring Joe Cox? If they had seen this coming, I feel like they wouldn't have initially made that move to move Kyle Krantz. So this seemed that's just what leads me to believe this is a little bit of a surprise. But that is part of a conversation. Is he option 1 for South Carolina at this point?
I don't really have a good sense of. I just know it's a possibility. I don't know if it's option 1, but you could move him, and then that sort of begs the question of how would the responsibilities shake out, because Krantz was a significant assistant on special teams. So could you promote him to just coach the special teams? Would he keep the nickels and Sams, or would he move over to say safeties, and then Will Muschamp move to linebackers for Mike and Will because he does obviously have experience there, and he obviously knows his own system and what he wants. But I'm not sure, but it is a possibility. Whether or not that will be the move, I don't know. I do know that there are going to be outside candidates that are considered throughout this week. As far as the timing, could something happen before this weekend? Maybe. Will it stretch into next week or longer? Maybe. I just don't really have a good sense of how it's definitely going to progress.
Well, I think that's the key takeaway probably that the fans are most interested in is that there will be other considerations, in potential interviews as opposed to just, hey, we're just going to make this move without seeing what else is out there. Hard to say right now what guys might, you can start to sort of maybe name guys that make sense. Chris and I talked about Rod Wilson being a guy that might make sense, former Gamecock linebacker. He's assistant special teams coach with the Chiefs right now, had interest in a job previously at South Carolina. You can sort of pick out guys that would make sense, but it's hard to say yet what direction Muschamp might go. But you hear about coaches sort of having a list in their mind at all times. I think that's true. Whenever there's an opening, coaches already sort of have an idea of, oh, that's a guy that I like what I've seen, I like what I've heard, I have a former tie to him, or there's normally, even if you sort of go, what is it, the Kevin Bacon 6 degrees of separation or whatever, there's some connection to where you hear these coaches know what other coaches they respect and have played against and seen that do a good job, et cetera, et cetera.
College football is very incestuous.
Yeah, so he'll check it out and then see if either Krantz is the right move or someone else is. I
would imagine that's a spot that Carolina would look to fill pretty quickly. We're like 40 days away from spring practice, and obviously you want to have that guy in place then, and you want to give him enough time to familiarize himself with the system that he's not, basically going through spring and trying to learn everything in the same way that his players are. So yeah. I don't know exactly what the timeline is on that, but this is a great opportunity to mention that if you want to be completely up to date on the search and eventual hire of South Carolina's next, I guess, presumable defensive assistant, whether it's linebackers, whether it's Nichols, Sams, wherever it ends up being, GamecockCentral.com is the place to do that. And GC Pod is what you can use as the exclusive podcast code if you want to get a month of insider access on Gamecock Central for free so that you can be up to date on that coaching search for South Carolina, so that next time you're hanging out with your friends, like, I don't know, watching the conference championships, and they're like, hey, what's South Carolina going to do about Coleman Hutzler leaving? You can be like, I know. Let me share this information that I acquired via GamecockCentral.com after some great work by Wes Mitchell and Chris Clark. So go subscribe to GamecockCentral.com. GC Pod is the exclusive code, month for free. Last bit of staff news for South Carolina. This is an off-the-field role. It's like nice. I don't know. It looks cool. Good story. Whatever. Nice passing of the torch. You go from an A+ to an A+. I don't know how much of a difference this makes, but people were very excited to find out that after Marcus Lattimore decided to leave his position as the head of the Beyond Football program, the player development, which people were sad about, people were excited to hear that he was being replaced by probably the only person, is it fair to say probably the only person that would be as fitting to have that role as Marcus Lattimore, and that's Connor Shaw? I mean, that's going from a real A+ to another A+ in that position.
Yeah, pretty natural progression, I think.
And a guy that the fans actually know, obviously, and
exactly. I mean, that for that transition, that's about as smooth as it could possibly go. I don't know what kind of impact that has in general on the football program or whatever. I don't really have an opinion about that. It's cool that Marcus is around. It's cool that Connor's around the program. That probably looks good. May help with recruiting, although they're not allowed to officially recruit. It's like, hey, look at this guy. You know who this guy. You recruits probably remember watching Connor Shaw when you were in middle school, when he lit up Georgia and 35-7 and all that stuff. But I don't know how much of a difference it actually makes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you need a guy to be around the players that has been through what they go through on a day-to-day basis, the ups and downs. I think one thing we don't talk about and doesn't get written about enough in college football is the mental hurdles, the mental grind, the mental just sort of negativity that also can creep into a player's mind, especially if they're not playing early in their career. And these kids go from being, they're recruited, they are told how great they are, they're most of them the best player on their high school team, they're big man on campus, they come, to college with these huge dreams, and not all of them are going to be successful. Not all of them are going to be great. Not all of them are going to play. And that realization is very, very difficult on a lot of guys. The mental aspects of being injured and being out and, not being able to play is also a tough thing on a lot of kids. And that part of it is not really put into focus enough. So having someone who's been through it, can talk them through it, can sort of be a sounding board for them and help them get help in those areas, I believe is a important aspect of every program, whether it's Connor Shaw doing it, Marcus Lattimore, or somebody else. To me, it's not really so much about who it is. It's just that they have someone there who can give them guidance in those aspects off the field.
And it's a nice story.
Yes.
Marcus Lattimore, thank you and farewell. Say the South Carolina fans, welcome to Connor Shaw, I guess.
And by the time they listen to this, they'll be able to watch the press conference introducing Connor Shaw.
So there you go. That about does it. I say about does it. We spent almost 50 minutes on that. It's supposed to be the offseason. Seriously, more has happened this offseason for South Carolina.
Off-season, though.
I mean, there's not, but this offseason has been more eventful than most of the football season was, which is remarkable and a blessing for us. Because
sign up for Gamecock Central.
Sign up for GamecockCentral.com. Rate, review, subscribe to this podcast. That's totally free, by the way. We give these to you for free. We just like doing it. I love sitting here podcasting with the two of you, especially when we get off on tangents about. Yeah, I stand. Y'all sit. Especially when we get off on tangents about gym injuries and Chris's hernia, which I feel like we hear about a lot. Maybe not on the podcast, but definitely off the podcast.
I'm whining about it.
I'm really sorry. That sounds awful, man. That's what like an organ pushes through your muscle, ruptures the muscle or something and pushes through. I think it's something like that.
It's similar to that.
Yeah. But you're better than
we won't
right?
talk about it since you just told me not to anymore.
No.
Now I whine about my ankle more.
Seriously.
I've moved to that.
You're fragile, man. I guess that's what happens when you get old.
Yeah, it sucks. Are we going to talk about the national championship a little bit?
Well, yeah, I got to get to a couple of recruiting things real quick.
Oh, yeah,
South Carolina's got some unofficial visitors in town this coming weekend.
We planned to talk about that.
Yeah, we did. We got it all in the rundown. Juniors, so class of 2021, unofficial. Y'all got a short list, some guys, or an idea? I don't know if y'all know exactly who's going to be on campus since it is in an unofficial capacity, but what are South Carolina fans, from whom should South Carolina fans be expecting to hear after this weekend?
You got a little...
Yeah, we got a little list of some guys that we've confirmed, and they're still building out the list, waiting on some more confirmations before this weekend, but, one of the... Well, first of all, there's a couple big names on the O-line from Georgia that are going to be in town. Cedric Nicely, who's a guy from Gainesville, teammate of Makias Scott, who signed with South Carolina in December. He's a guy that they like a lot and is someone that hasn't picked up a ton of offers yet, probably will pick up more, into later this year, but they really like him a lot, jumped in early. Micah Morris, who's a higher 4-star guy who has offers from, everywhere, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, Clemson. As someone who's been on campus a lot, I think Auburn and Georgia have probably had more traction as of late, but getting him back on campus, a positive.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the guys I talked to in the industry says basically Mike Morris should be the number one offensive tackle in the country. Some people think that highly of this guy, that he's just an athletic freak, future starting SEC left tackle potential.
Can he sign in February? For next year?
No.
Double early signing period?
He's going to enroll early, literally, an entire year. All right, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, you're good. That's a good point. A couple others to watch. Jordan Dingle, he's a 4-star tight end out of Kentucky. South Carolina, was familiar with his brother during the recruiting process as well. Brother Justice ended up at Georgia Tech, so Jordan's a guy he's been on campus before, going to make his way back, 4-star tight end. And another one that really stood out to me is Thaddeus Franklin. He's a 2021 running back out of Miami, a former Miami commitment. And he made an early commitment to Miami when Thomas Brown was on staff. So Thomas Brown was his lead recruiter. And, as soon as Thomas Brown moved over to South Carolina, we started hearing, Franklin was still committed to the Canes at that time. But we heard that, South Carolina would be a consideration. So I think this is the first time they're getting him on campus since then. And so I think it'll be interesting to track and see what happens there. But it'll be those guys and some other ones from the 2021-22 class really over the next few weeks. But this weekend I think is going to be a pretty significant one.
Especially if you can get a guy that might be the best left tackle of the entire class. That sounds like a good person to be in with early if you're South Carolina. Now, not a lot has changed with the 2020 class. Obviously, early signing period wrapped up, and nothing else can happen in an official capacity until The late signing period begins in February. But Wes, do you have any worthwhile updates on the 2020 class, or is it still pretty much the same list that South Carolina is looking at for this late signing period?
Pretty much the same list, but there is a little bit of movement with some of these guys. The one we've been tracking the most and probably have had the most content on is Jakari Caldwell, Northwestern wide receiver. Still appears to be a major target for South Carolina. He has set his official visit to Columbia for the final weekend before the February signing day, which is February 5th. So that's like January 31st, I believe, is that Friday. So he'll be in. South Carolina will get the last shot at him. The big sort of interesting thing to track there is that Clemson has been sniffing around him as a possible offer. That would make things interesting. For one, we don't know if they're actually going to offer. Depending on who you talk to, the level of interest there is, either here or there. We're not sure quite if they're going to actually step forward with the offer. They've at least made it known they're interested. If they offer, I think he'll at least consider them because of where that program is, what they've done with wide receivers, et cetera, et cetera.
Losing the national championship? Yeah, great place to be.
But I still think South Carolina is in the best position, even if Clemson offers. So we'll see. That'll be one to track. And then Henry Parrish, the running back from the state of Florida, a guy that South Carolina's been in on for a while now, took an official visit during the season. He's going to make his decision at some point this week. That'll be something, if you are a subscriber, continue to look on the website. We are efforting finding out the latest there. Been a little, it's a guy from South Florida area. It's never that easy to get consistently good information on these kids. It's hard to sort of lock in, but South Carolina's in it. Ole Miss has been mentioned a lot with the Lane Kiffin hire, some new excitement there, but he is someone to at least keep an eye on. So those are the two guys right now, at least as far as the next week or so, to keep an eye on some possible movement with those guys.
Just a couple more podcasts between now and the late signing period, so we'll keep you all posted on all those movements and anything that we don't get to on the podcast. As you mentioned, Wes, GamecockCentral.com will have all those scoops for you, provided you are a subscriber. For the most part. There's some free stuff on there that's good, but if you want all the good, got to be a subscriber. You mentioned the national championship game. You mentioned Clemson. I really want to make this about Clemson, but this is about LSU. 42-25. LSU kneeled inside the 5 to end the game. They missed a field goal. Jamar Chase dropped a touchdown pass right before they ended up missing the field goal. They started at least, I'm just doing it off the top of my head now, so don't at me if the number's wrong, but I think they started 3 drives, maybe 4 drives, inside of their own 10-yard line, and they still scored 42 points. They could have easily scored more than 50. They were -5. They covered that comfortably. I guess the only negative from that game, from my perspective, was the over-under, which I didn't bet on, by the way, but I told people to bet the over. Do you know what the over-under was, guys? You know where it finished? It opened at like 70 or 71, something like that.
Is it 67?
It finished at 67.5, and the game finished 42-25, and LSU took a knee inside the 5-yard line. So all the people that I told to bet the over, I deeply and sincerely apologize. That's a real bad beat right there. But for me, this is all about LSU. Is that fair? Is this all about LSU for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, they're the best team in the country. They had the absolute perfect storm that made. I mean, how does this happen? That Joe Burrow, this guy with immense untapped potential, is already on your campus. You have these wide receivers, which LSU has always had talent at wide receiver, and they've blown that talent. And then this 30-year-old dude, Joe Brady, who happens to be with the Saints, comes in, revamps your passing game, but it happens to be able to fit in with your other coaches, your offensive coordinator, who sort of has to be willing to let this young hotshot dude come in and take, away a lot of your shine, really, a lot of the credit, even though you're still calling the plays. And it all fit together to make what literally may be the greatest college offense that we've ever seen.
They scored more points than any offense ever, but they also played a few more games than most offenses have had the opportunity to.
Yeah. So, and then one day later, it's pretty much blown up. Joe Burrow will obviously be in the NFL. Joe Brady will be in the NFL, much closer to us now, right down the road in Charlotte. And this sort of just 15-game flash of greatness, happened, and now it's over. But it was pretty awesome to watch while it happened. Lots of questions for LSU. To expect them to, they're not going to fall off, obviously, immediately.
I think they have 2 seniors on defense and maybe a couple other guys that'll leave early, but that's not going anywhere.
But to expect what we saw this year from the offense, I don't think that's very. I don't think that's going to happen. But still, just amazing, fun to watch. It felt like for about a quarter, Clemson and Venables, they were throwing some stuff at LSU that they didn't really have an answer for. And then once they solved the riddle, it was on and it was over.
I don't know if there are many people that like Joe Burrow as much as I do. Chris is definitely on the short list.
Yep.
60 passing touchdowns. Chris.
Crazy.
How much do you love Joseph Burrow?
Oh, he's the man.
Did getting to 60 touchdowns, which again, who was the kid from Hawaii? Was it Colt Brennan?
Yep.
Awesome.
So he broke Colt Brennan's record, and as much as I am a Joe Burrow stan, I don't know if that should totally count because I imagine Brennan did it in 12 or 13 games, and Burrow had an extra couple games to do it. I'm fine giving him the title. I was actually, I don't even want to say really sad. I was devastated that he did not finish the season with the completion percentage record, which Colt McCoy now holds by 0.4 of a percentage point. And I don't know if all the drops in the national championship game necessarily would have made the difference. I haven't gone back to actually do all that math. But very unfortunate. I wanted him to have that record. But over 5,600 yards, 60 touchdowns, over 76% completion percentage on almost 11 yards per attempt. His passer rating was over 200. Was this the greatest season by an individual player in the history of college football, Chris?
Oh, wow. You went really hard. So, first of all, Colt Brennan did that in the 2006 season, and they played 14 games.
Okay. Oh, conference championship and then bowl game. Okay. All right.
That's right. Yep. And they only lost 3 games that year. They went 11-3.
So one more game, and you beat the record by 3 touchdowns?
Yep.
And you're not
playing.
You're not playing SEC defense.
Yeah, they played. I mean, LSU beat 7 top 10 teams.
Okay, but I don't like that because Texas was number 9 when they played, and Texas was not a top 10 team. But here's what I do like.
Who's better, Texas or Nevada, Eastern Illinois, Fresno State, New Mexico?
For sure. But no, you're making the right point. You're just not doing it the right way. They beat. They beat the preseason top 4 team and 5 teams that finished in the top 8 at the end of the season, which is what matters. Because again, Texas I think was still a good team, but the preseason top 4 was
they were okay.
In no particular order: Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Georgia, and they beat all of those teams.
Yeah. I mean, Georgia, they lit up Georgia's defense is really good. Mm-hmm. They lit those guys
Clemson's
up.
Defense overrated all season long, overinflated stats. Still a good defense.
Still
I don't
good
think
defense.
But
yeah.
Let's see. Clemson's defense was probably the third best defense that LSU faced this year, probably behind Georgia and Auburn, similar to Florida.
I could go with that. Yeah, I could go there.
So tied for the third best defense that LSU faced this year. But it didn't matter. So I guess that was Joe Burrow. I mean, he had an unbelievable game, 460-something yards, 5 touchdowns, no picks. But it was a season low for completion percentage in a single game. His second lowest completion percentage in a game, that was like 63%, I think, was a national championship. His second lowest completion percentage for a single game this season, I think, was that Utah State game, and he completed like 67% of his passes, which is just mind-numbing.
Yeah, I mean, and one touchdown drop, there's one other that went through a guy's hands, just sort of got there a little bit quick.
I mean, Jamar Chase had 3 drops in that game. He had an awesome game anyway, but he had like 3 drops, 2 of them early, and then obviously the touchdown that he dropped.
And that was Justin Jefferson didn't even get involved until late. You know,
I couldn't believe it. I looked at the box score at the end of the game. Yeah. He had 9 catches for over 100 yards. I don't think he had his first catch till halfway through the third quarter.
That's what it seemed like. I mean, it was late, and the tight end, obviously made a lot of plays, and Burrow, stepping up and being able to run. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, awesome again.
Dude, such an underrated back all season long.
Offensive line did a good job. Clemson was undermanned a little bit up front. They played that 3-1-7, and Niles Pinckney was out. Their strength has been the back end, right? Isaiah Simmons, who is as good a player as I've seen in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, their linebacker play was good. They lost Skowski later. Simmons was still really good, and then that back end. I mean, A.J. Terrell had good cover, pretty good coverage, about as well as you could hope for a guy to cover someone like Jamar Chase, and the throws were just perfect.
Yeah, perfect throws, great catches with guys, right there in phase at times. Who had the best season? If we're giving Burrow, who did he just surpass, basically? Because for me, I had Cam Newton.
I was going to say, I think 2010 Cam.
Yeah, 20, and I was just looking, I was trying to sort of compare them. Cam...
He had 50, I think, total touchdowns. I think he had like 26 passing and 24 rushing or something like that.
He had 30 passing touchdowns and 20 rushing touchdowns.
Just 30 and 20? Okay, so 50 touchdowns.
Yeah, he rushed for 1,473 yards.
That's a lot.
Which
and
is
passed
insane.
for what, 3,000?
Let's see.
2,800.
Yeah, passed for 2,854 yards.
So Joe Burrow passed for more yards than Cam had total, including one of the greatest rushing seasons we've ever seen by a quarterback.
Yeah, that's insane.
That's stupid. Now, I did this, I guess, right after Joe Burrow won the Heisman on my local show. Poll question, discussion day. Who has the best individual season ever? There's some like 88 Barry Sanders, where he rushed for 2,600 yards and like 30-something touchdowns, I think. So, in the same way that we will have to wait several years to really earnestly have the conversation about where this LSU team as a whole is in the pantheon of all-time great college football teams, we probably should wait to give ourselves some distance so that we don't suffer from recency bias with Joe Burrow. But the way that he did it, as efficiently as he did it, and that's the thing that, really just, the stats are amazing. But so 60 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, a 10-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. That's stupid.
Can I present one more to throw in?
Yeah, please.
2007, Tim Tebow.
Oh, yeah.
All right. 67% completion. Almost 3,300 yards passing. 32 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. 23 rushing touchdowns. 895 rushing yards.
Still fewer total touchdowns. There's still fewer total touchdowns than Burrow had passing. And he probably had what? Probably had a handful of rushing touchdowns. 4, 5, 6 maybe.
Who's this?
Burrow.
Oh, Burrow. Yeah. Not sure about that.
I'll effort that. And then I wonder how many rushing yards he had. I wonder if he eclipsed.
He had about 300 or so, I think.
Oh, my gosh. 300? Because I think he had like 56, 70. So he needs like
368 rushing yards with 5 rushing touchdowns.
Okay, so he eclipsed the 6,000 total yard mark. 6,000. Is that right? 56, 71 plus 3 whatever? Yeah. As long as it was more than 329. If it was 56, 71, which I think it was.
It was. I'm looking at it.
6,000 yards, 60 touchdowns, 6 interceptions.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I was about to say. This dude's gunslinging out there, but he only threw 6 picks.
I know. Well, and that's the amazing part. He throws it deep, which is why the yards per attempt is really important, because he's not just dinking and dunking. Like, I think Colt McCoy, when he set the record for completion percentage in a season, his yards per attempt was like 9, which is still pretty good, but it's not outrageous. Like 11. I think that's the 6th or 7th highest yards per attempt over the course of an entire season in the history of college football. But I'm just playing this out in real time now, so forgive me if this is a little bit harebrained. But 6,000 yards, 60 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. I love Joe Burrow. He's confident. He's cocky. He's amazing. Does that confirm that he's the Antichrist?
I knew you were going there.
6,000, 60, and 6?
I don't really know how to respond to that, but he also threw 527 passes.
Yeah.
To throw 6 interceptions, and that was the thing about, when it was finally like a little bit of time left in the fourth quarter, they started being like, all right, we're going to run the ball and get out of here. But otherwise they just kept throwing it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that was the thing. They're dedicated to the throw game, and they stuck with it.
That's what they do. Stay aggressive. That's how you win.
The only surprise I had was when they attempted that field goal.
Me too.
Early on, I was like, oh, they're going for this.
It was like 4th and 4 from the 30.
Yeah,
and their kicker was like 12 of 19 or 12 of 20, something like that.
Yeah.
That surprised me. And that was disappointing because that was the difference in possibly the overhitting.
I think, let's see. I'm going to get back to the question. I'm going to.
About him being the Antichrist?
No, not that one. I don't even have a great reason for this other than just what I saw with my eyes looking at both guys. I put Cam Newton 2010 over Tebow any season. Because Tebow was awesome, man. But
his intangibles make the difference for me, though. Like just his will, his indomitable will. Not
We're
that
just
Cam
talking
didn't
about
have
the
that,
season, right?
Cam Newton had a lot of will to win a lot of football games
Alabama,
too.
that Iron Bowl was ridiculous. I don't know. I just think about Tebow as like the consummate leader.
Well, he is. He's a great leader, but I'm just talking about just what they did. You know,
one season output.
One season output, or even pick any of. I think the 07 season for Tebow was the most.
That was the
productive
Heisman
one.
year, but not the national championship year. It was like Chip and
they played
6
in
and
13
8.
games, so that couldn't have been the.
Yeah. I think they won it in 6 and 8, and then he won the Heisman the year that he didn't win the national championship.
Right. So I mean,
scored
you just
like 100 touchdowns in Columbia.
Yeah, I was going to say 100 of these.
Yeah, I think it was
50
95,
touchdowns
95,
were in Columbia, but I just strictly really all that, and I don't even have Cam's numbers anymore in front of me to compare him, but I would still put Cam above just because Tebow, I got to dock him a little bit because some of his was Percy Harvin left, Percy Harvin right, and Cam had some good players too. But
who's Cam's best receiver?
So much of what he did was individual. Darvin Adams, maybe. What was that guy's name?
Did he have Trey Mason in his backfield?
He had Mike Dyer.
Oh yeah, that's who it was, Michael Dyer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he had a little scat back guy that I can't remember his name.
Okay, but you're right. That's a really good tiebreaker. We're trying to remember who Cam's position or his skill
Ontario
position players
McCaleb?
were.
Yeah, McCaleb.
So he had. I'm trying to look at the receiver.
All right, so is Cam or Joe Burrow higher for you?
That's what I was trying to get to next. Yeah, Darvin Adams.
Yeah.
Sorry, good pull by me there.
Heck yeah, it was.
And Philip Lutzenkirk in the late.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was on that team. Man, that is really.
Think about all the good teams that LSU beat. Think about all the points they scored. Literally the most points ever in the history of college football.
I think I got to go with Burrow.
All the good defenses.
Yeah.
Unbelievably
the difference maker. When you really look at it, you go Burrow. You look at his really good runner, also, and really smart, and how he navigates the pocket and can buy time
and
can
stays
run out.
behind the line. There was one play in the national championship where he's scrambling, and 99 out of 100 quarterbacks just take off and pick up 3 yards or whatever. But he kind of does the. We saw Pat Mahomes do it in the divisional round this past weekend, where he kind of tiptoes right on the line of scrimmage and then just flicks a little pass forward and ends up being a 15-yard pickup.
Burrow's a way better runner, better athlete, and way faster than because he's such a good passer.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That side doesn't get, but
he's so smart about it.
Yeah, and the quick decisions, like when he decides I'm gonna go, like the dude gets
no
up to
hesitation.
speed. Yeah, and how about that quarterback draw before the half?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
On third and goal to score. The one to set up the other touchdown. Yeah, on 3rd and 10.
But if he gets stopped short of the first down,
no points.
No point. I mean,
that's a great call.
That's one of those calls where it's a great call
if it works.
And then if it doesn't work, we're all talking about what an idiot.
Yeah, but fortunately, he was channeling Dylan Thompson on that one.
Yeah, well, they felt good about it too because they know how smart of a runner he is, right? So they can feel good.
Both quarterbacks are so much more mobile than people give them credit for. They're both really good runners. I mean, Trevor Lawrence, we saw it, especially in that semifinal game. 16 carries against Ohio State. I don't remember how many yards he ended up having, but that was kind of the difference in that game in terms of Clemson getting the offense back on track. And then for Burrow, it was weird for the first time this year, and I've watched a lot of LSU. I've watched some of at least most of their games. We saw Joe Burrow in the first half get a little bit of happy feet, and we never see him do that. And then he settled into the game a little bit more, which makes sense. It's a big stage. He'd never been there before, so it makes sense that there's a little bit of adjustment. And then by the end of the game, he was calm and composed as ever, staying in the pocket, keeping his eyes downfield. But early on, it was like, Joe Burrow looks a little nervous, but he got that out of his system pretty quickly. But all the defenses that he's done it against, and again, Clemson, I don't think that I think their numbers are overinflated. I don't think that's a crazy argument. I don't think me saying that means I'm like super biased and like against Clemson or anything, although I am. I think Clemson's defense is still really good, but if you're making the argument just based on the numbers, I think you're making the right point for the wrong reasons, and I think we saw that on display. It's a great LSU offense, but I don't think Clemson was the number one pass defense in the country.
No, and I think some of the happy feet early was that Clemson had a game plan. They came out in the 1-3-7. LSU, I think, struggled early on to figure out where these blitzes were coming from, and they were coming from every angle. And it seemed like once they sort of made some adjustments on that, and there was a little bit more time for him to operate, he started making some throws. Then his receivers settled in. They started making plays like they have all year. And it's crazy how much flow is like big in an offense, like rhythm. And you could just feel. I kept waiting on Clemson's offense to have that moment where you're like, all right, they're about to go score 3 drives in a row too.
Right.
And
there were times after LSU missed the field goal.
Yeah.
There was another sequence. There were a couple sequences where it felt like that's where Clemson gets back in the game, and LSU's defense was terrific. Everyone made a big deal about Ohio State's corners, Okuda, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but LSU's got every bit as good of defensive backs. And people were dumping on LSU's defense all year because they gave up a lot of garbage points. The counting stats weren't great, but obviously Stingley's the only freshman on the All-American team, and Christian Fulton's going to be a first-round pick, and you got Grant Delpit, who's also probably going to be a first-round pick, and Chason had a really good year at linebacker, and Queen, I thought, had a really good game there in the national championship. Just across the board, they were really, really good defensively. And the other part of it, the storyline that hasn't been talked about enough, which I think is fine, because, like I said, I think this should be about LSU, and maybe Carolina fans maybe want to make it about Clemson, and that's fine, because that's fun, but Trevor Lawrence, sub 50% completion, just missed a ton of passes, and look, the coverage was really good. Towards the end of the game, as Clemson was in a hole and they had to pass it, LSU was a little more comfortable just pinning their ears back and getting after Lawrence. They got some pressure on him. They knew that it was coming, so it's easier to defend that. But he missed a lot of passes. Sub 50% completion percentage, no touchdowns, no picks. He did have the fumble and like 250 yards. Joe Burrow significantly outdueled Lawrence. And everyone was saying, Lawrence is the better quarterback, and he may still be the better prospect, but this was Joe Burrow's day.
It was, and Lawrence just some uncharacteristic missed throws. Still had some really impressive throws too. Almost had a pick. Joe Burrow almost threw a pick that would have been
that would have been a house call.
Yeah, it would have changed things. But yeah, he just, and I don't really know if there's a specific, not really a rhyme or reason to it. I mean, Trevor Lawrence obviously played in big game situations before. He just wasn't on as much.
Well, I think it's just credit to how good LSU's defense actually is, despite what people thought all season long.
Yeah, I mean, they played well. Christian Fulton, gave up some plays, but he's still a really good prospect. I mean, Clemson's receivers are really good. Derek Stingley had another really good game. Grant Delpit did a nice job. Tyler Queen, the guy you mentioned, he was all over the place.
Yeah, he was awesome.
And their defensive front, I think, played well, just sort of keeping Lawrence at bay, getting just enough pressure. They dialed up, Dave Aranda dialed up blitzes at some just right times where they just got enough pressure or just able to affect things.
Yeah, he and Venables both, I think, had really, really good game plans. And I think Brent Venables deserves a lot of credit for getting this Clemson defense to where it was, because I think we saw, just looking at individual matchups all across the field, and again, it's hard when you're matching up against LSU, maybe the best offense ever, certainly the best offense we've seen in a while. It's hard to look at those matchups and say, well, look, they're not actually that good. But I think Brent Venables did a really good job, in setting this defense up and building it. And then the game plan that he brought specifically for this game, even though LSU scored 42 and they still could have scored more early in the game, you saw him doing an excellent job of making this defense, I think, greater than the sum of his parts. Yeah,
and I think that's the big, early in the game, I thought, okay, Clemson, which I'm not surprised, had a good plan early. And Joe Burrow mentioned that after the game. They put together a good plan, did a good job. But it was, can they adjust? And I figured they probably would, because they've done that all year. I figured they would make some plays, just some one-on-one plays, or Joe Burrow would make a play, and they certainly were able to do that. I think for Clemson this year, the biggest thing is, we'd seen in the past where their strength was the defensive front and the secondary, the back seven struggled. It's been sort of the opposite this year. They've structured things around the secondary. Isaiah Simmons, who's really, really good, he's going to be a first.
Like, what even is he?
Round draft. I
saw the breakdown of all the positions that he played, and he lined up on the defensive line for a couple snaps.
Yeah.
Obviously, he plays a lot of linebacker, safety. He does everything.
Safety. Yeah, I mean, he could play.
Where's he
anywhere.
going to get drafted? What's he going to get drafted to play?
Probably an outside linebacker, but he could certainly play safety. I mean, he'll be a pass rush type guy from that position, I think. So yeah, I mean, he's been really good. But they've built, they've structured things more towards that back end because they lost so many guys up front, and their strength on the back end has allowed them to look better, almost a little bit of smoke and mirrors up front, whereas in the past it was the opposite. But they did have a good plan, but LSU, after weathering that storm early and getting a few key defensive, that was another thing. They got some key defensive stops that allowed the game to say, 17-7 instead of Clemson going up by 3 touchdowns. Mm-hmm. Then you got a way different game. So the defense for LSU was really a key early.
It was huge. It was great. It was a fun game, fun season for LSU. I've been pulling for them. And it was funny. I listened to my preseason Get Cocky podcast right here on the Gamecock Central Podcast Network that I did with Drew Dixon. We did some over-under win totals for all the teams in the SEC. I said over on LSU. I predicted them to win the West. I said Joe Burrow is going to be the emergent star in the SEC. The only thing that I didn't do in terms of those predictions was go far enough in predicting Joe Burrow to be the greatest quarterback ever in the history of college football and LSU to win the national championship and go 15-0, maybe be the best team ever. But it was so fun to watch. Like I said, I was excited for it even before the season started. So it was just really fun to kind of watch that all come to fruition. And odds are, if you're listening to this, you are probably a Carolina fan, so you're probably especially happy, even if you don't particularly like LSU. You're probably very happy that you don't have to hear from your Clemson fan friends. It was nice to go on social media on Tuesday morning and see just kind of like normal stuff on social media. It wasn't totally inundated with, a lot of orange. So I will just leave it at that and say that it was really satisfying. But yeah, it was fun. For Wes, for Chris, thank you all so much for listening. Went a little bit long today. Hope you all enjoyed it. Just had to get some national championship talk. We normally stick South Carolina, but that's the biggest game in all of college football. But we'll be back next week. A little more recruiting stuff again as we get a little closer to the late signing period. And hopefully at that point we will have an update for you for South Carolina's new assistant coaches. Coleman Hutzler has left for the Texas job. In the meantime, rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. Colin Taylor and I had a preview of the Kentucky game. If you're listening to this Wednesday before the South Carolina-Kentucky basketball game, go check that out. Colin and I broke down South Carolina's Tennessee loss and looked ahead to the Kentucky game. And he and I will be back again tomorrow to break down the Kentucky game and look ahead to South Carolina's trip to College Station as they take on Texas A&M and try to right the ship here in SEC play. So a lot of good stuff going on the Gamecock Central Podcast Network. Rate, review, subscribe. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.